almost never hear it. The Speaker of the House of Representatives of the United States declaring this country is now in a, quote, constitutional crisis. Speaker Pelosi saying we are now at that point because of the way the Trump administration is dealing with the criminal evidence against the president contained in the Mueller report. Trump also, as you may have heard, demanding all sorts of people in his inner circle simply defy the subpoenas and the requests for information and evidence. Speaker Pelosi says this is not the end, this contempt vote that is rattling Washington and the White House. She says they are prepared to hold other officials in contempt. And as you may know, when you go down the org chart, the less important people are way more likely to end up in a real jail cell if they have legitimate contempt proceedings against them. Now, Donald Trump trying to stop Mueller from, of course, breaking his silence. And this is interesting. The president going pretty off script at an event that was billed as a discussion of medical billing. Trump making a new case that seems to conflict with his own old arguments about why he didn't obstruct justice.
At the end of the testimony, no collusion and essentially no obstruction. Of course, a lot of people say, how can you obstruct when there was no crime, when there was no collusion? How can you possibly obstruct? I'll tell you, but it's worse than that. It's not only was there no crime, but the crime was committed on the other side. So we're protecting against the crime committed on the other side.
Essentially, no obstruction. You know, when you're talking about a felony, it could be obstruction, could be grand larceny, could be a violent felony. You don't really ideally want to be using the qualifier essentially to say why you didn't do it. And this may show, this may be a mistake, it may be a tell, it may be a moving of the goalpost. Whatever it is, though, the president is clearly concerned that Bob Mueller is going to go in there and say something more than total exoneration, and now his message starts to shift. Now, as you know from watching the news, we want to keep you up to speed. What Bob Mueller did in his careful report was not actually issue a legal conclusion on obstruction. He basically said, here's all the evidence, and he noted explicitly that when it comes to the president, a special case, the Congress will ultimately decide whether and if to do anything about it. Then, of course, Attorney General Barr decided, no, we're not going to give this to Congress yet, and he went and famously announced his personal conclusion. So we're at this inflection point because Democrats are saying, okay, given everything that's happened, and now that the report is done, it's time to hear from Mueller himself. And then you have Donald Trump, for the first time ever in his presidency this week, asserting executive privilege. House Judiciary Chairman Jerry Nadler saying all of this requires more fact-finding and that they want to hear from Mueller. The testimony date could be delayed, but they're going to hear from Mueller. Now, Trump also used his remarks today to try to, again, undercut Special Counsel Mueller.
Bob Mueller is no friend of mine. We had somebody that is in love with James Comey. We like James Comey. They were very good friends, supposedly best friends. Maybe not, but supposedly best friends. You look at the picture file and you see hundreds of pictures of him and Comey. And with all of that and other things, he wanted the FBI job. I don't know if anybody knows that, but as you know, he was considered for the FBI job, wanted it. And the day after he didn't get it, he became the special counsel.
There's a lot in there. I'm not going to spend all our time fact-checking it, but there are not hundreds of documented images of these two appearing together. Whether or not they're in love is a matter of the human heart. I'm not even going to bother. But as for that other piece of evidence that Donald Trump claims to have, that Mueller wanted the FBI job, if you've read the Mueller report, you may know. Totally false. The fact-finding and the conclusions in the report note that the White House asked Mr. Mueller, as a courtesy, to give Donald Trump views of the FBI during the tumultuous period where he was trying to find a new FBI director, and Mr. Mueller agreed to do that. And it was not a formal job interview. That's important because you're seeing, again, Donald Trump balancing his two messages. One message is this is over, don't worry about it, total exoneration. But today, maybe under the pressure, maybe under the cracking, maybe under the contempt vote, maybe under the fear that Bob Mueller could soon break his silence, Donald Trump hitting his other message, going back into things that have been disproven by his own aides and by the record to impugn Bob Mueller, which makes you wonder, why is Donald Trump so worried about Mueller breaking his silence?
Mr. Barr told lawmakers that he didn't have a problem with Mr. Mueller testifying.
I'm going to leave that up to the Attorney General as to whether or not. I think, to me, it looks like a redo.
Leave it up to the Attorney General. This is the Attorney General who, of course, is under pressure for contempt for one issue. It's not other stuff. It is hiding parts of the evidence from the Mueller report. It's refusing to turn over those documents. And that brings us to the other thing I told you about, that again, is if it feels like there's so much happening, there's so much drama, there's such extreme language, well, we are hearing from public officials who have been careful along the way. They're using extreme language because they say the president is acting in extreme and potentially unlawful ways. They're saying we are now in the, quote, constitutional crisis.
Do you agree with Chairman Nadler that the country is currently in a constitutional crisis?
Yes, I do agree with Chairman Nadler. It's a path that is producing results and gathering information. And some of that information is that this administration wants to have a constitutional crisis because they do not respect the oath of office that they take.
I'm joined now by Katty Kay, Washington anchor for BBC News, Matt Miller, who worked at the Justice Department under the Obama-Holder administration, and Juanita Tolliver, Director of Campaigns at the Center for American Progress Action Fund. Matt, when you see it all laid out there, the president's need to raise his other defenses and water down some of his older claims about obstruction in an unrelated event, and the pressure on him and Attorney General Barr and what the Speaker is saying, what do you think is actually happening here? And do you agree that we are actually at a crisis, or is it not that time yet?
You know, I think how the courts respond to what's happening and whether they're able to respond quickly is going to determine whether we're in a crisis or not. I think where we are right now is we're seeing a complete breakdown of the constitutional order. The fact that the White House is not just refusing to turn over documents on one thing. If it were just not turning over documents on the Mueller report, well, while that's unacceptable, it might, it could be something that could be worked out over the usual course of business in the courts. But it's not just that. It's the House's investigations into family separation. It's their investigations into the administration's failure to defend the Affordable Care Act. It's issue after issue where they are just refusing to turn over any documents that gets you to the point where the normal constitutional order has broken down. And I think if the courts allow that to go on for any extended period of time, if they take their usual course of action, which is to allow the White House to drag this out for months, if not years, then I think, yes, we are in a constitutional crisis. And I think what the Speaker said something very interesting today, which is they're not going to bring this resolution of contempt up right away. They may wait and see another committee do the same thing. There may be other cabinet members held in contempt. They may try to enforce other subpoenas. And I think what they're trying to do potentially is put together a litigation strategy where they go to the courts and say the point I was just making, which is it's not one thing, it's everything. And if you don't step in and make this administration change their behavior immediately, a constitutional crisis is upon us, and congressional oversight may be dead forever.
Yeah, you put it starkly. And Katty, the Attorney General has shown himself to be willing to really push the limits. He was at a departure ceremony, a celebration of sorts for Rod Rosenstein. There are any number of ways to deal with that. You certainly don't need to get into your own legal problems if you don't want to. This is how he dealt with it. I want to show this to viewers. Attorney General of the United States speaking in public here in the wake of this historic vote of contempt by the Judiciary Committee. Take a look.
In those days, the deputy job was a lot different. But I'll tell you now, the Attorney General job was a lot different also. You like records. This must be a record of Attorney General being proposed for contempt within 100 days of taking office.
Yeah, funny thing to make a joke about, right?
And for an Attorney General.
For an Attorney General who is facing a contempt charge. There are lots of debates amongst constitutional scholars about whether we are in a constitutional crisis at the moment or whether we get to that point when a court goes through this process, issues an order, the White House then defies it. And would that actually be the moment of constitutional crisis? So there is some kind of debate about whether we're there or not. I think the issue for the White House is whether they are overplaying their hand, as Matt is suggesting, by defying demands on every front from Congress. And then the issue, I suppose, for the Democrats, on the other hand, is whether they risk overplaying their hand by asking for so much that they weaken their legal position as well. This has to go through the courts. And the question, as we've seen in precedent on this in the Bush administration, is whether we actually get to a resolution when Donald Trump is still in office.
Yeah, and Chairman Nadler is very clearly driving this with all the legal sophistication that he has. I mean, it's so fascinating the way these relationships sometimes transpire, because Donald Trump and Jerry Nadler other, have dealt with each other. They understand each other. I believe in a certain way, although you wouldn't know it recently, I actually believe in a certain way they privately respect each other's hustle. They are tough New Yorkers. So Donald Trump knows deep down exactly who he's dealing with, and that Nadler has a plan beyond one vote, one hearing, and that Mueller, of course, looms in the background. With that in mind, take a look, Caddy, at Chairman Nadler saying what they can also do today.
Eventually, we will hear from Mueller because we will, if we have to, we will subpoena him if we have to. I certainly hope it doesn't come to our necessity to subpoena him.
What does it tell you that there is now such a concern over Mueller talking?
That phrase that Donald Trump used today, in that kind of slightly long, rambling spiel that he gave, talking incessantly, I'm not as convinced, perhaps as you are, that word essentially cleared of obstruction means that Donald Trump is really backtracking. I wouldn't be surprised if Donald Trump goes out to his next campaign rally and the headline is "No collusion, no obstruction." It's possible that he's there.
Let's talk it out, because I think you raise an interesting counterpoint. To me, I'm wondering whether, when he controls the overwhelming narrative of the report, he's comfortable in the no collusion, no obstruction landscape. And he thinks, and he may be right, he's quite cynical, but he thinks that if Barr and their echo chamber on television says this to enough people, that's more or less the end of it. And that if Mueller has a made-for-TV, nationally broadcast presentation of the evidence, even for that crowd, the no obstruction whatsoever doesn't seem to hold as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, whatever Trump said today about this is effectively Barr's decision, there is no doubt that Trump does not want Mueller to testify. What is in this for Trump? To have Mueller, the person who has the ultimate respect and who is the author of the report, come out and say, actually, the president's definition of whether he was cleared of obstruction was not my definition. And to say that to the American people, and it would be blockbuster viewing, get out the popcorn, everybody would be watching that particular moment. So there is no vested interest in the president having that moment. The White House does feel there is still an interest for them in having Democrats launch impeachment proceedings. That is
right,
still
that some of them may think that fight is good for them.
They think that fight is still worth them
Which is,
having.
again, that's just the politics. So then you have both sides talking about politics instead of the serious constitutional obligation. Juanita, what do you think of all the above?
I think, honestly, when he has his next campaign rally, Trump is likely going to be saying, well, what is collusion? What is obstruction? And muddying the definition further, because what he understands is his base probably will not dig into that nuance. They probably already don't believe Mueller. And so he's just going to double down on that. And this is straight out of his playbook. Like you showed earlier, he's already criticizing Mueller. He's already throwing false accusations out there about his reputation, trying to sully his name as well, because he knows that eventually Mueller is going to testify, and he's going to blow the lid off of everything that Trump's been hiding, leveraging executive privilege to do it, and now laying a blanket statement that none of the people associated with him should respond to subpoenas.
And Juanita, what did you think of Bill Barr's handling of the contempt issue today?
Come on. If this is a joke in his mind, that says a lot about his character and what he really believes, as he's supposed to be the top law enforcement officer for the American people. This just double downs on the fact that he is really right alongside Trump, working as his personal defense attorney on all of this.
And let me just push Matt on this, who served for the only other sitting attorney general who was held in contempt. Matt, although I think the tone was different, there are plenty of folks who would say that you and your boss basically worked very hard to discredit any effort for contempt, even though ultimately it did result in, and I'm simplifying, but a somewhat adverse ruling that disclosed evidence. How do you respond to that?
Look, I think they're very different, not to go back in time to Fast and Furious, but there's a very different, it was a very different thing then. By the time Holder was held in contempt, the Justice Department had turned over nearly 8,000 pages of documents. They made multiple witnesses available for interviews. It was really one set of documents that they were trying to hold on to. And as you note, they eventually lost in court. That's very different here.
Mixed decision. I would call it a mixed decision, but go ahead.
Mixed decision, but for the most part lost. It's very different than what's happening with this Justice Department, where they're refusing to turn over anything. They're refusing to make witnesses available. It's very clear that the president is going to assert executive privilege over Don McGahn's testimony. And as for Bob Mueller, I think it's pretty clear the Attorney General is already blocking his testimony. He may eventually testify, but the House wants him next week. They've been asking for him for a while. It's pretty clear, I think, at this point, that seems unlikely likely to happen. At some point, it's, I think, obvious that they don't want any witnesses to come forward because, as you point out, there are a lot of things Trump doesn't understand. I think sometimes intentionally doesn't understand, but one thing he gets is television. And he knows that if Bob Mueller comes up and testifies, if Don McGahn comes up and testifies, suddenly those dry words in a report that most of the American public don't read come alive on TV, and that's a problem for him.
And that's where all the serious constitutional legal stuff intersects with how people learn things and make up their minds. It's the same with debates, and everyone knows in campaigns you try to lower the expectation, you try to raise the expectations on your opponent in a debate because of the way it's going to play. Well, if this is where it ends, you could argue that Barr did a lot of spin that worked. I think the concern is they've actually changed the expectations game, where people hear out of Mueller's mouth 5+ more felonies in the way the evidence is presented. The expectations game may boomerang on them. So it's like that's why we're in this high stakes thing. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.